Canadian food processors and suppliers are pushing back against fees slapped on by this country's dominant grocery chains. The processing and food industry says the fees are harming their already thin profit margins. We're joined by Sylvain Charlebois, Professor and Senior Director, Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University in Halifax. Sylvain, always great to talk to you. Thanks very much for joining us. Just remind us, what are these fees?
Well, this has been going on for several years, but with COVID now, of course, a lot of grocers are looking at the market very differently, and they need financing. And so what they're doing is that they're implementing new strategies. They're looking at new ways to get to our money, to generate new business. But of course, in return, they'll go back to their vendors to finance. So in Walmart's case, they are now deploying a very aggressive e-commerce strategy because we're buying more food online, of course, and other things. But of course, they're asking their vendors to pay for that strategy and support Walmart. So the strategy is worth about $3.5 billion, and Walmart is expecting vendors, processors, to pay for that.
And it's, of course, this issue, as you say, has been going on for a few years. A while ago, the Competition Bureau had a look at fees Loblaw was slapping on, although it ended up taking no action. So this has been a long-running grievance for the food industry.
Oh, absolutely. And these things are hard to prove. And that's why food processors in this country, and by the way, Andrew, the food manufacturing sector has lost 12 jobs a day, every day since 2012. The sector is not doing very well, and it needs protection, and that's why right now they're complaining because of this pressure being put on by grocers across the country, and that's why they're requesting the establishment of a code of practice, a code that you would find in the UK and Australia, for example.
I mean, some might say, you know, it's a bit rich, the grocers slapping on these fees when they're doing so well in sales terms during the pandemic. People aren't eating out, so people are forced to consume meals at home. It's great for the grocers.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, 2020 is going to be a very good year for grocers, but looking ahead, things won't be easy for them. They've always had to fight for margins. The agri-food sector is all about high volume with low profits. It's always been that way. And so even though Loblaws will generate $50 billion worth of revenues, the profit margins are very slim still. But the problem right now is that they're taking on more of that margin, and they're not leaving some money on the table for participants across the supply chain, from farmers to processors and the rest. That's why there's a lot of tension within the supply chain right now.
You note that we have essentially an oligopoly in food retailing in this country, and there's a real risk. I mean, if we see our food processing industry further damaged, strategically it's not great for the country. I mean, we need to be able to process our own food in Canada.
Absolutely. If we don't make processing, food manufacturing the centerpiece of our overall agri-food strategy as a country, everything is compromised, from food sovereignty to food security, for example. Creating jobs becomes more difficult. Creating jobs in rural economies becomes more difficult. And most of the innovation that we've seen over the last few decades in Canada and elsewhere as always came from manufacturing overall. And right now the sector is bleeding, it's suffering, and that's why they're asking for a code of practice. And frankly, I think it's long overdue. I think we need to look into this. And when we look at UK or Australia, there's more peace and there's more growth economically in agri-food overall from farm to fork.
That's interesting. I mean, but you hear about codes of practices. I mean, there's always loopholes, isn't there? But I suppose it would supply a template, at least some kind of a standard.
Oh, absolutely. The devil's in the detail. Absolutely. And there's not a cookie cutter approach to Canada. You can't really look at the UK and implement the same thing. Players here will have to agree on specific terms. The reality, though, is that some actually are arguing that food inflation could go way up as a result of a rigid code of practice. That's not necessarily true because if you compare the food inflation rate of the last decade in the UK, Australia, and Canada, it's very much similar. The difference is that the wealth, the newly generated wealth, has been spread out over the entire supply chain and not just to support one portion of the supply chain, which is distribution.
Yeah, because I mean, it kind of disappoints me that you go into a supermarket, you see food imported from Europe, processed elsewhere. Well, I'm thinking dairy, and let's not go down that road. But Canada isn't a food. I mean, Canada exports raw, unprocessed food products, obviously canola and wheat, but not very much processed food, as far as I know.
No, exactly. And this is a huge miss for us. And during COVID, Andrew, we saw how fragile food manufacturing is in Canada. We were always one COVID case away from shutting down plants everywhere. And as a result, farmers pay for that. They're stuck with livestock. It increased their costs. And on the other side of the supply chain, there are distributors and retailers looking for new products, looking for locally grown, locally made products. And because of the lack of support that manufacturing is getting, well, we have to import more food from elsewhere, which is unfortunate because there's lots of great stuff going on in Canada. We just need to protect it and support it.
I always wonder, should we change the Competition Act? Because as far as I know, they have to find definite harm for consumers. Maybe they should broaden it out to include other abuses, other excessive power for some players.
Absolutely. Well, right now, let's say, for example, with the bread price fixing scandal, which occurred for 14 years in Canada, the Competition Bureau is still looking into this matter. Why? Because it is complex. It's very complicated. And so I think overall we need to make sure that we harmonize relationships within the supply chain to allow players to really have a voice. Because right now, there's a lot of politics going on right now. Grocers are positioning themselves as the protector of consumers. And frankly, Canadians don't know much about processing, really. It's kind of the forgotten child. Even governments tend to forget about manufacturing. And so that sector in particular needs a voice.
Sylvain, thank you very much indeed. Always great talking to you. Sylvain Charlebois of Dalhousie University in Halifax.